Jaune Arc did not feel confident. Though he had told Izuku Midoriya that they would become heroes together, after UA's written entrance exam, he wasn't sure he was even gonna make it into the school. While he wasn't dumb, academics certainly weren't his strong suit. And to make matters worse, he had gotten lost. Despite his father being All Might, he had never actually been to the UA campus, and he was getting a bit worried considering he needed to learn how to do the practical exam, and he couldn't find the auditorium. His own worries were put on the back burner, however, when he heard not quite an explosion, but close enough to warrant investigation. When he got to the source of the sound, he saw a beautiful girl with white hair walking away. He thought to go after her to try and learn her name, but instead decided to do the heroic thing and go towards the other girl. The one who had fallen to the soot-covered ground in misery, and he could hear muttering, "Welcome to UA." He stepped forward, offered his hand to her, and introduced himself. And thus, as in so many other worlds, Jaune Arc met Ruby Rose. Their interaction as they walked through the UA campus trying to find their way to the auditorium was much like the one Jaune had had as a child with Izuku. Only instead of discussing quirklessness, Jaune brought up how Ruby seemed to be a bit too young to actually be going to UA. Ruby confirmed that she was only actually 13 and had gotten into a bit of trouble for illegally using her quirk to stop an escaping criminal. In order to help her, Principal Nezu offered her a deal to try and enter UA early. Not wanting to be labeled as a villain before she even turned 15, Ruby agreed. Jaune was impressed and admittedly a bit self-conscious. This 13-year-old had already done more heroics than he had when he was supposed to be the heir to the greatest hero to ever live. Still, he brushed it off, and was happy to have Ruby as a new friend. She reminded him a bit of Izuku, and for Ruby, she was just happy to have someone who was easier to talk to. Though that didn't help the embarrassment they both felt when they found their way to the auditorium and the presentation had already started. By a strange twist of good luck, they ended up going to the same testing grounds for their practical exam. But in a not-so-strange twist of bad luck, the nervousness combined with the bumpy bus ride left Jaune puking on the ground as soon as they got there. No, in this world, Jaune does not escape the moniker of Vomit Boy. While there were many other applicants at their same testing grounds, two were particularly notable for Jaune. The white-haired girl that had gotten into a confrontation with Ruby before they met, and a strong-looking red-haired girl that Jaune didn't get a good chance to look at before it was announced that the practical exam had begun. People started running before Jaune could even know what was happening, and he was surprised to see Ruby at the head of the pack having turned into a burst of rose petals and dashed forward. Jaune activated One for All and ran in as quickly as he could. When he encountered his first robot, he ran forward, destroying it with a single punch, and discovering that punching things really hurt. While he had done a lot of physical training, that was to get his body ready for his quirk. He did not have much in the way of combat training. While it certainly wasn't as bad as the time he had broken his arm when he first got his quirk, he really did not like punching metal. It was then that he saw that Ruby had grabbed a piece of one of the robots and was using it as a kind of dagger, using her quirk to dash behind 1 and 2 pointers and striking at their weak spots. Taking a cue from his new friend, Jaune ripped off some of the armored plating from the robot he'd destroyed and used it as a kind of shield, both to block any attacks coming toward him and others, and just, running through things. Jaune, now with 31 points from destroying the villain bots, was feeling pretty confident. This confidence drained, however, when the 0-pointer arrived. Jaune found himself very afraid of the behemoth before him, and was preparing to run away when he saw that Ruby was still near it, next to a pile of rubble that, upon a closer inspection, he saw had the white-haired girl buried underneath it, holding it off of herself with some strange glyphs. He stopped himself from running and muttered to himself, "I need to get back there, they need help." He was then surprised to see the strong-looking red-haired girl from earlier standing next to him, and hearing her say, "Let's do this." Jaune nervously nodded, but then confessed he didn't know if he had enough power to stop that thing. At least, not without destroying his body, which he kept to himself. The red-haired girl, who would later introduce herself as Nora, grinned and grabbed his shoulder, still coursing with the lightning from One For All. Over with RWBY, she was desperately trying to pull the rubble away from the girl who had called herself Weiss. She heard the zero-pointer drawing closer and looked up to see the foot standing right above them. She closed her eyes in fear and prepared to be crushed, only for the metal to never come down on her. She looked over and saw Jaune and Nora holding the foot above their heads. Nora had used her quirk to absorb the lightning from One For All and channel it into her muscles, matching Jaune's strength and allowing the both of them combined to keep the foot steady. Unfortunately for Jaune, Nora was much shorter than him, so while she stood tall holding the foot above her head, Jaune had to bend down slightly, releasing a small groan of, "My back." Moments later, RWBY was able to finally release Weiss and dash her away, doing the same for Jaune and Nora once she came back. The four of them stood around looking at the zero-pointer, wondering what they should do. Weiss suggested they just leave, it wasn't worth any points. Jaune was going to agree with her. Run and live was a plan he could get behind. But RWBY shook her head. She told them that they were training to become heroes, and a hero wouldn't let a threat like this stand. The other three were surprised by the passion the 13-year-old spoke with, before Jaune felt a bit of shame for his own desire to run away. Jaune nodded his head in agreement, followed shortly by Nora and then Weiss. RWBY smiled and then awkwardly asked if anyone had a plan on how to stop it. While the others were quiet, Jaune looked up at the towering robot, an idea forming in his head. He turned to Nora and asked how much electricity she thought she could absorb. After Jaune explained his plan, they all set about their roles. RWBY flew around the zero-pointer's head, grabbing its attention, while Weiss used her glyphs to mitigate collateral damage. All the while, Nora stood with Jaune, him feeling his muscles strain as he increased his percentage of One For All. He didn't want to risk overwhelming Nora with 100%, so instead he channeled about 50. He was pretty sure he'd need to go to Recovery Girl after that for bone fractures, but hopefully it would work. Finally, Nora absorbed the energy, and Jaune gave the signal. He threw Nora up with as much power from One For All as he could bear, while Weiss created a path in glyphs for RWBY to catch her. RWBY intercepted Nora and sped the two of them toward the zero-pointer's head, crashing into it and leaving a huge indentation as it fell backwards. As RWBY brought them both to a rooftop to look down at their work, Jaune looked up at them in amazement, while the exam ended almost immediately afterward. The next few weeks had less excitement. Jaune's father was busy preparing to start teaching at UA, something that he had to make Jaune promise not to tell anyone, while Jaune's mother was stressed out. Apparently her half-sister Amber, a hero in America, had gone missing at around the time of the entrance exam, and no one had been able to find her. Jaune was somewhat worried for the aunt he had never met, but he couldn't really do anything to help her at the moment. When Jaune's results for his entrance exam came in, he was excited. He had barely passed the written exam, sure, but he had landed at 3rd place in the practical exam, having received 31 villain points and 45 rescue points. The only two people ahead of him was someone named Bakugo, who he felt like he might have heard of from someone before, but he wasn't sure, and RWBY, who had gotten only 24 villain points, but a whopping 60 rescue points, landing her firmly in 1st place with 84 points. He was even more excited when he went to talk to Izuku later that day and found out he had passed too. His friend had only been able to achieve 10 villain points and had been very despondent since then, thinking that he had no chance of making it into UA. But the rescue points he received from helping others during the exam had pushed him just barely into making it in. When Izuku told Jaune had to let him know that he was floating off the ground before the green-haired boy used his energy tendrils to pull himself back down. Now would be a good time to tell you what Jaune did to help Izuku at the end of the last part. After realizing that his hidden quirk of Amplification had attached to One For All's transferal capabilities, and in turn revealing to him that other quirks were also stored in his father's gift to him, he believed that he could transfer some parts of those quirks to other people, while still keeping One For All within himself. In his mind's eye, it looked as though each of the quirks from previous users of One For All had had copies created for each user since the original wielder of that quirk. While he couldn't tell what most of the quirks were, and he wasn't able to use them for himself, two of them had come to the forefront of his mind. Two that he thought could work very well for Izuku. The quirk of the 7th wielder of One For All, Float, and the quirk of the 5th wielder, Black Whip. He and Izuku both knew that when combined, they could create some very interesting combinations. And it also could be passed off as an evolution of his mother's quirk, being telekinesis and bringing things closer to her. Jaune was able to transfer the quirks to him, and the two of them named the combined ability Slingshot. When Jaune told All Might about this, he was surprised and a bit frustrated that his son hadn't told him in advance, but decided that One For All was now Jaune's to do with as he wished. When Izuku asked Jaune what class he was in, stating that he himself had been placed in 1A, Jaune finally looked at his own assignment and was confused. On the paper, it said he was in class 1L, which he had never heard of before. When he asked his father about it, All Might explained that Class 1L was a new experiment from Principal Nezu for students with extenuating circumstances, as well as those who wanted to pursue both the hero course and another course alongside it. It even included a dormitory system for those who could not commute. Jaune accepted the explanation, but was disappointed he wasn't going to be in the same class as Izuku because of his extenuating circumstances. When the first day of classes finally arrived, Jaune was pleasantly surprised to see that RWBY, Nora, and Weiss had all been placed in the same class as him. He might not have his best friend with him, but at least he still had some people he knew. He was going to go greet them, but was interrupted by their homeroom teacher, Professor Glinda Goodwitch, showing up. She told them all to get to their seats, and her authoritative voice ensured that they listened. Jaune found his seat next to a red-haired girl that he didn't know, but must have been popular considering how many people were surrounding her before Goodwitch came in. He smiled and waved at her, and she did the same, though hers seemed a bit strained. Goodwitch gave them a rundown of what their life at UA would likely be like, and then gestured them toward the gym uniforms they were provided. She told them that after orientation, they would be heading out to the courtyard to perform a quirk assessment test, then muttering about how it was actually a very good idea when it wasn't being used to threaten students. Jaune couldn't help but think that there was probably some history there. Jaune found orientation to be quite dull, but was looking forward to the quirk assessment test, though everyone seemed much more excited than even he felt. While he had taken physical assessment tests in his homeschooling, he hadn't had a quirk for most of his life to feel like he was missing out on using. He could tell they were looking forward to finally being able to cut loose. Jaune just hoped he didn't make a fool of himself. And in a shocking twist of fate, luck actually turned in his favor. With the tests going as you might expect of them, RWBY dominating any speed-based tests, and Jaune consistently placing in the upper echelons of pretty much anything. Having the all-around boost from One For All doing wonders for his scores. He was slightly annoyed how Nora kept using him as a battery for any strength-based test, but her friendly and happy demeanor not letting him ever get too frustrated. The ball throw test did have some surprises for him though, with Jaune only placing 5th overall in the class. The first surprise was when a girl named Trivia Vanille used her quirk to create a solid illusion of herself that just carried the ball until Goodwitch told her to stop, placing her firmly in 1st place. And then the second surprise, coming when a blonde girl, who he had seen RWBY standing next to before, jumped at him and told him to punch her in the face as hard as he could. In surprise of the action, he did so. When her eyes turned red and her hair burst into flames in response to that, Jaune came to the conclusion that she was just really scary, especially when she beat his score because of it. The others who beat his score were the only two that scored higher than him in overall rankings. Two red-haired, green-eyed girls who'd gotten in through recommendations. Their names were Penny Polendina and Pyrrha Nikos. Jaune found their similarities in appearance and them both getting in through recommendations, along with both of their names starting with P, to be a bit funny. Pyrrha's quirk was called Polarity and allowed her to control metal. She used it mostly to slightly augment her physical capabilities, using metal bracelets and anklets to make her run faster and go farther when jumping. While on the ball throw, she connected a metal hair clip to the ball and used it to accelerate it to an insane speed. Penny's quirk was called Android, and Jaune didn't really get it. It was apparently a powerful physical enhancer type quirk, but also allowed her to shoot green lasers from her hands and feet, which in turn allowed her to fly. Jaune thought that quirk sounded pretty overpowered, which was ironic coming from him. It just didn't sound like a real quirk to him, and something was itching at the back of his head, but he let it be. After the quirk apprehension test, he learned that apparently some kid with grapes on his head from UA had gotten expelled, but he didn't really know anything about that. He met up with Izuku after school, and so, their life at the Hero Academy began. The first couple of weeks were pretty standard school in Jaune's opinion, with two notable exceptions. The first being their first heroics class, where they would do combat training. Jaune had been paired with Pyrrha, and learned that apparently she was kind of famous. He apologized that he had never heard of her, but she seemed strangely happy. Jaune didn't really get it. I mean, if you were famous, why wouldn't you want people to know who you were? Still, he had the feeling that this was the beginning of a strong friendship. They were even able to win their first combat exercise, with Jaune coming up with a plan and Pyrrha's prodigious combat ability allowing her to execute it flawlessly. On a similar note, RWBY had gotten paired with Penny, and the two of them seemed to hit it off immediately, though Penny seemed much more clingy to her first official friend than RWBY did. The other exception was when they were electing class representatives. Goodwitch decided to let them vote, and at the end, Jaune and RWBY were tied with 4 votes each. They tried deciding who would take the role with rock, paper, scissors, but after their 5th tie in a row, Goodwitch got frustrated and declared that they would just share the job. At lunch, Jaune would usually eat with either Izuku and his friends from Class 1A, or his own friends from Class 1L. Being mostly RWBY, Nora, and Pyrrha, and the people that came along with them. Namely, RWBY's scary sister Yang and her friend Blake, as well as Penny, Nora's friend Lai Ren, and Weiss, who was just a big fan of Pyrrha. That day, Jaune decided to sit with Class 1L to ask who the 4 people who voted for him were. Though Pyrrha was a bit surprised that he didn't vote for himself, she revealed that she was one of the people who did. Nora chimed in that she also voted for him and got Ren to as well. Finally, RWBY chimed in and said that she was the last one who voted for him. Jaune was surprised by this and revealed that he had actually voted for her. They didn't get into it at the time, but both of them believed that the other had more leadership qualities, with RWBY thinking about the tactical mind Jaune had shown in the battle against the Zero Pointer, and Jaune thinking about how RWBY had showcased more heroic qualities than pretty much anyone he'd ever met, aside from maybe his dad and Izuku. They then worked out that Yang, Blake, and Penny had voted for RWBY, while Weiss had voted for herself. Finally came the day of the first field trip of the year, going to the USJ. Goodwitch told them how, in an attempt to save time, Class 1L would be split in half, with one half being sent with Class 1A to the USJ, and the other half going with Class B later. Jaune would go with Class 1A along with his friends, except for Penny, who had been placed into the second group. Along with them would be going the girl named Trivia, and another student named Emerald Sustre. Jaune was glad to be able to go there with Izuku and his friends from Class 1A, but the entire bus ride, he couldn't help but feel like something was off. And it wasn't just his motion sickness this time. Something just didn't feel right. And when he got to the USJ, it got even worse. Suddenly, he felt a shooting pain in his head, and he knew that danger was coming. He looked up ready to call out to warn people, but it was too late. In the middle of the USJ, villains had arrived. And that is where we're going to leave the story for now. Tell me in the comments, what other characters do you think should be in Class 1L? I have an idea of who I think is in there, but tell me what you think. And until next time, safe journeys, my friends.